This product makes no sense. It's too small to be an effective headphone amp. And it costs too much to be a compact DAC. And yet, I often marvel at people that can carve stone or wood into incredible sculptures. It's like they can see the essence of an object nestled within the larger mass. The Dethonray M1 is a little bit like that. It's like Anson from Dethonray saw the essence of a DAC and headphone amp nestled inside much larger products, and so he whittled away all of the excess to find the perfection that was hiding in its core. Actually, that's wrong on two levels. Firstly, the listening M1 was built from the ground up, not by whittling away a larger product. And secondly, it's not quite perfect, but we'll get to that. First, let me tell you a little bit about the listening M1. This is a DAC with headphone outs, preamp outs as in variable line outs, and it fits basically in the palm of your hand, but it's not actually portable because it needs a hefty 24 volts of power to create its magic. It's got USB, coaxial and Bluetooth inputs. It's got balanced and single-ended headphone outputs. It's got RCA connections on the back for the variable line out, and those also become auxiliary inputs if you're in auxiliary mode. This little box does pretty much everything. The digital inputs all perform to an identical level, so you can use any of them and know you're getting the same level of sound quality, and the variable line outputs mute if you plug into either the 3.5mm single-ended or the 4.4mm balanced connection. So if you want to run a set of active monitors or some other amplifier off the back of the M1, it is going to mute those outputs when you're plugging in your headphones. That makes it really easy to work with. It's basically a miniaturized all-in-one desktop headphone solution. That is everything except the Bluetooth antenna. That's definitely not been miniaturized. But let's take a step or 6 back in time. It's 2018 and Anson has just created his company Dethonray. His first product was called the Listening T1, and that was T for tube. The T1 was a large 26 kilogram tube amp costing $10,000. It was well received in the Chinese market where it was first debuted, but its cost and its size made it very difficult to mass produce. But, like most first attempts, it was a learning experience for Anson. Having come from developing products for brands like Sony, Jabra, Hi-Fi-Man, he had a lot of technical expertise, but was still finding his brand's niche. When Anson saw how little power was actually required to drive most headphones, he realized that the 30 watts available from the Listening T1 was a massive overkill. And so he started thinking about how to make smaller, less powerful devices that placed an emphasis on sound quality and timbre rather than raw power. Don't sleep on the M1 though, it's still outputting 5 volts into a 32 ohm load, and that's good for about 780 milliwatts. In other words, it's going to drive all normal headphones to dangerous listening levels very comfortably. After spending a few years releasing portable products like the very well received DTR1 digital audio player or DAP, and then also the Bluetooth headphone amp called the Pegasus SG1 that I've reviewed here, I love it to this day, it was time for Anson to return to this idea of a high-level desktop quality system. From there, it took a further 2 years to finalise the design of the Listening M1, and that meant ensuring that the power supply, the DAC, the amplifier module, that all of those were optimised both individually but also to work together. For Anson's vision to work, they all had to be optimised and miniaturized to fit into a tiny package like this one that could be easily moved around to an office, a bedroom, a living room, wherever you might want your music. According to Anson, the most difficult part of designing the Listening M1 was finalizing the DAC stage. In case it just sounded like I said duck stage, I'm not talking about ducks, I am talking about DACs. Anson tried multiple different chips before he landed on the final combination that's in the M1, and that's the wonderful combination of the AK4191 and a pair of AK4499 DAC chips, all from AKM. This combination of DAC chips is popping up in all kinds of high-end devices. It's an absolutely wonderful DAC chip combination. Of course, it does still come down to how well it's paired up with the output stage, the headphone amp stage, etc., and we'll get to that soon. With the DAC stage nailed down, there was still a whole bunch of testing required to finalise what I have here today as the Listening M1. That was both subjective and objective testing, and then on top of that, it was also to define and refine the 2 different sound styles that this can produce. It took about 6 months for that process of refining the sound before Anson then sought some feedback at some hi-fi shows to come up with the final version of the Listening M1. So this is truly a case of a master craftsman obsessing over every little detail of their creation. This is not a quick throw together product. This is literally years and years in the making. What it also means is that this is a product intended to live for the long term. It's not going to be replaced by a Mark II or a Pro or a Plus or an Ultra version in 6 months' time. It's a proper flagship product designed for the long term. And that's really important when the price is $2,599 US. Yep, $2,600 for this teeny tiny device. So it better be pretty special, right? Well, thankfully, it is. The sound from the M1 is organic and smooth, but very resolving. It produces a sound that's spacious, it's well separated, and it's highly engaging as well. It kind of reminds me of a little sonic box of chocolates where it's got all the different flavors covered, and by flavors I mean imaging, soundstage size, tonal qualities, resolution, details, smoothness. Everything's in that little box of chocolates, and every single one is done to perfection. What's more, it's got those 2 modes that I mentioned before to give you even more flavors. In these 3 little dip switches on the back is a timbre mode switch, and what that's going to do is change the way the digital filter and the analog low pass filter interact and work together to produce a sound that's a little bit more lush, a little bit more mid-range forward, but it keeps everything else that I've described exactly the same. So you're not going to lose resolution or detail or soundstage size. You are literally just shifting the tonal qualities or timbre of the listening M1. So you've got 2 devices in one here. As an example of timbre mode in action, on Coming Back to Life by Pink Floyd, engaging timbre mode better balances the twang of the plucks of the guitar with the resonance and the richness of the guitar's body. Now, this was testing using the FiiO Utopias, so the experience might differ a little bit with some other headphones, but that's kind of the point of timbre mode. You can choose when you use it, for which headphones you use it, etc. And the good news is that it's subtle enough that you're not going to need to switch it on and off for different music. It's one of those adjustments that you'll probably find if you like one track in timbre mode, you like all tracks in timbre mode. Where I think it's going to be more useful for people is either they're going to have certain headphones or earphones where it suits that particular combination the best, or you're going to find which one you like and you're just going to stick to it. The key point is that both timbre mode on and timbre mode off both sound fantastic. I would probably leave it on all the time with something like the FiiO Utopia 2022 version, and that's because timbre mode reminds me of plugging the headphones in to a super resolving and detailed tube amp. It's bringing that little bit of lushness that a tube brings without any of what some might perceive as the negatives of tubes. It brings that sense of warmth and richness to the mid-range, but as I've already said, you lose no resolution, no imaging focus, no staging size, everything else stays exactly the same, which is wonderful. You just get a slightly more rich sound. Now, while we're talking switches, there's 2 more on the back of the listening M1. One of those switches will jump between USB 1 and USB 2 mode, and that means you can plug this into things like gaming consoles if you want to, and it will work. And then if we think about the 3rd switch, that's for the IEM or headphone mode. Think of that as kind of like a super duper gain switch. There is a gain switch on the front of the device, but jumping between IEM and headphone mode on the back gives you even tighter control over the volume if you're running with IEMs. And so it all seems like a perfect combination of size, performance, and features. But I said before, it's not quite perfect, and we do need to talk about that. Firstly, let's talk about the volume control. Behind this interestingly shaped volume knob, which is really nice to interact with, is an analog volume pot. But the volume control within the M1 is digital. How that's being done is some fancy software that reads the voltage coming off the volume pot and then translates that into a digital volume level within the device. And that's both good and bad. Where it's wonderful is that by having an analog volume pot, the feel of changing the volume on this is wonderful. It's also, though, going to give you the perfect channel matching that only digital volume controls can provide. So right down low, you don't get that channel imbalance that a traditional analog control will give you. So that's all good so far. Where things aren't quite so good, though, is that because you've got this interaction between the analog pot and the digital control, sometimes what I find is that in very subtle adjustments, you're not getting a gradual crescendo of the volume. What happens is that you hit a certain point and the digital system goes, oh, there's been a change, and it jumps the volume up. Instead of getting that gradual analog increase in volume, what you hear instead are these tiny little jumps. It's not bad. It's not like it's going to jump to a super high volume and blow out your eardrums. It just means that it's a little bit kind of jumpy in the steps that it moves through. Not a big deal, not uncomfortable, but it's not quite perfect. Another issue that I've had with the M1, and I've spoken to Anson about this, is the fact that when I was switching on and off the music quite quickly, or the sound quite quickly, because a lot of this happened when I was editing videos, there's a really teeny tiny popping noise that comes through on most headphones. Now, I can't stress enough just how small this sound is. It's not a loud crack, it's not a loud pop, it's not going to cause any pain, discomfort, or danger to anybody, but it's a little bit distracting and annoying. I think it's only really going to be noticeable if you're skipping quickly through an album or a playlist, you're jumping through tracks. For me, I noticed it because I was editing videos, and that requires a lot of stop-start sound as I jump back and forth to find edit points. What it sounds like to me is that it's as if there's a little mute circuit being engaged when there's no signal coming through, and you're just hearing that mute circuit being turned off and on when you're rapidly changing tracks. Now, that might not be what's actually happening, because I never hear it if you go from an extended period of silence to then playing music. I don't hear any of that noise. It's only with the rapid switching of tracks that I ever hear it. But something is happening there, and it's very, very slightly annoying. But very, very slight only. As I said, I can't stress enough how low of a level the actual noise is. The other thing that's important to know is that I've mentioned it to Anson, and I believe he's already looking at a firmware fix in a future update. The final thing for me about the M1 that's not quite perfect is these little skids on the bottom here. So the idea is that when you put the M1 on your desk, it's got these two little feet to sit on. That's going to help with cooling. There's plenty of airflow under the device. But because these are just metal skids, there's no friction at all. And on some surfaces, the M1 will slide around a little bit when you're plugging in and removing your cables. Once again, I believe Anson's already onto it, and they're looking at producing, I think, something like a little silicon boot to go on each of the skids. So there are a couple of minor hiccups and a pretty high price tag. And whilst the M1 definitely does sound great, there's some pretty tough competition in this kind of market. The Hyphaman Serenade is an R2R DAC and headphone amp that comes in at $999 making it way cheaper than the Listening M1. It's also a huge amount larger and a huge amount heavier too. The two devices do also have some slightly different features, with the Serenade offering some limited streaming capabilities through an RJ45 network connection, as in no Wi-Fi. So they're quite different in many, many ways, but they're a single device desktop headphone solution. And with the price difference, if you've got the room to spare, maybe the Serenade's better. Listening to the Serenade is immediately smoother and warmer. It's actually a little bit thick in the lower mids. And in comparison, the M1 brings the vocals more forward and with a greater sense of texture. There's also more sense of articulation and detail from the M1. And so on stringed instruments like, say, a plucked guitar, you get more sense of that energy of each plucked note, whereas the Serenade does tend to smooth it all off just a little bit. If we think about percussive sounds, so drum kits, snares and cymbals, the M1 does a better job of realizing the resolution, the detail and the textures of those as well. And so comparing them side by side as just standalone units, the M1 clearly steps out ahead. The Serenade might be a better choice with edgier gear, and what I mean by that is that if you're running a pair of headphones that are a bit bright and a bit aggressive, you may find the Serenade better. But I think in every other way, the M1 takes the lead, and all of this is testing when it's not in timbre mode. So if you do want that slightly lusher sound, just flick a switch on the M1 and you're closer to the lushness and the warmth of the Serenade without having to worry about losing the resolution and detail. However, if you've got the budget and you've got the space, you could actually buy the Serenade and a separate headphone amplifier, and you're still going to come out cheaper than the M1. Adding an excellent Class A amplifier such as the Auna S17 Pro to the Serenade combo, you're still only spending about $1,700 US. You are going to need a lot more space, you're going to need some extra cables, and you're going to have more stuff going on your desk, but in terms of price, you're way, way cheaper than the M1. Using the combination of the Serenade and the S17 Pro, what we now get is a more neutral and drier setup, a more textural type sound compared to the Serenade on its own. The Serenade's internal amp is quite a thick, rich and lush sounding amp. It's probably, in my opinion, the area that the Serenade is let down a little bit, because the internal DAC is fantastic. Now, even in the non-timbre mode, it's the M1 that's a little bit richer, a little bit lusher in its presentation, but it's not lacking in detail or texture. So they're now going toe-to-toe in details, resolution, and texture, but it's actually the M1 that's the slightly lusher and richer sound, which I personally prefer a little bit. That drier approach of the Serenade and the S17 Pro stack is going to highlight more details. Initially, it sounds like there are more details to be had, but when you go back to the M1, you realize they're all there. They're just not being emphasized or highlighted by the M1 sound. I'm not saying that's good or bad in either direction. They're just different presentations. One area that I do think the Serenade and S17 Pro clearly pulls ahead is in things like soundstage size and image and separation. You get a little bit more space, you get a little bit more separation of each sound, and that allows you to more clearly pinpoint each sound in space just a little bit on the Serenade and S17 Pro stack. It's not a big jump forward, but if you're just looking for pure technicalities and you don't care about space, number of boxes, number of cables, etc., the Serenade and the S17 Pro is technically slightly better. What I mean is better on the technicalities. However, if you want a fantastic sense of resolution and detail without sacrificing that slightly more euphonic, engaging, lush sound, the M1's definitely got you covered there. Another fantastic contender to the M1 in this kind of all-in-one desktop headphone solution space is the recently released FiiO K19. This comes in at $1,350 and is an amazing little bag of tricks. The K19 is a fairly compact device as well, not to the same degree as the M1, but it's definitely pretty slimline, and it's got some really interesting features and capabilities that the M1 doesn't have, and you should definitely subscribe if you want to find out more about what I'm talking about there. For now though, we're going to focus on the comparison in sound only. On resolution and detail, these two are very, very similar, as in, I don't know that you could split them. The only significant difference that I could find with lots of back and forth listening was that the M1 does produce a noticeably increased soundstage depth. As I listen a little bit deeper, there are also a few subtle nuances that you can pick up with the M1. And what I mean by that is that some of the subtleties in recordings, for example, Someone Like You by Van Morrison, the sounds like the snares and the cymbals were just a little bit overdone by the K19. Whereas I felt like the M1 was finding the nuances in the music and balancing sound better so that it sounded much more like a live performance from the M1 versus an incredibly technically capable rendition of a recording from the K19. However, with the price of the K19 being so much cheaper, you could once again, if space, cables, etc. is no object, you could add another amplifier. Adding the Auna S17 Pro again, we're still $500 cheaper than the M1, and it significantly closes the gap, but it still can't quite catch up. The output from the K19 and the S17 Pro is still quite left-right. There's a bit more space, a bit more separation, but it doesn't quite get the same degree of layering and depth that the M1 can deliver all by itself. So clarity, resolution, detail, all of that is fantastic with the K19 and S17 Pro setup. It's just missing that last little 2% that takes the M1 over the line in terms of the nuances in the sound, the layering in the sound, the sense of three-dimensionality of the singer, the instrumental, whatever it is that you're focusing on. The M1 just gets it that little bit more lifelike than the K19 stack. The listening M1 is a realization of Anson's original vision. It's a compact, high-quality, timbre-first, all-in-one device. You're no doubt paying for a combination of design and size and performance here. On sound quality alone, it's probably overpriced, but so is a Ferrari if you just want to drive to the shops. The listening M1 to me is all about the combination of its attributes, its size, its design, its performance and ease of use, and of course its sound quality. If you don't value that combination, it's not for you. If you do value that combination, I think you'd love it. As a bedside device, a device for a small desk, a device that you can take to a hotel room with you, or maybe one that you can take into the office. I'd recommend probably locking it in a drawer when you're not in the office. The listening M1 might just be the best combination of features, size, and performance that I've heard, next to something like the Chord Hugo 2. And that's huge praise coming from me because I think the Hugo 2 is fantastic. Both of those devices are similarly priced, had their own strengths and weaknesses, but are both undeniably excellent products in their niche. And so as always, links are down below if you want to know more about the Dethonray M1 or pick one up for yourself. And a huge thanks, as always, to channel members here on YouTube, to channel Patreon members, and to those of you that send super thanks on your favourite videos here on YouTube using the button just down below. If you've enjoyed this video, you'll probably want to watch my review of the amazing and much more affordable Dethonray Pegasus SG1 portable Bluetooth DAC headphone amp thing. You'll probably want to check that one out next, and I've linked it up here for you. For now though, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.